surprise you to hear that the world leaders on that are at UCSD. I don't know if anybody knows Barton Palmer. I've never met him myself, but he's in the Department of Psychiatry, and he's at the VA. And he's been kind of one of the 3 groups that are working on this. And he's kind of a leader on it. So I'm just going to talk about one of his papers. It's too bad Pat's not here. She could tell me what's happened since 2007. So this is 2007. This is kind of a meta-study. It's a study of a critical review of 16 studies that have been trying to look at the neurophysiological deficits associated with MAC-CAT T-scores, essentially. So here's the critical review, the association of specific neuropsychological deficits with capacity to consent to research for treatment. There's 16 different studies. They all have different methodologies, but a lot of them operate by taking MAC-CAT T-scores and then trying to map them onto various kinds of neuroscans. So let me just give you a few extracts from that. I don't want to talk about it too much. Here's Palmer's abstract. You can recognize this, I think, neuroethics. Informed consent is key to ethical clinical research and treatment, but partially rests on the ability of individual patients or research participants to use disclosed information to make a meaningful choice. Although the construct of decisional capacity emerged from legal and philosophical traditions, several investigators have begun examining the relationship of specific neuropsychological abilities to decisional capacity. This line of research may foster development of better consent procedures, as well as aid in refining the construct of decisional capacity toward a form that better reflects the underlying neurocognitive processes. These ongoing efforts represent an important conceptual and empirical bridge between bioethical, legal, and neuropsychological approaches to understanding meaningful decision-making processes. So that's the kind of agenda. So what do they find out? So here's the conclusion of the meta-study, 16 studies. Basically, the result is negative. No particular cognitive abilities or tests stood out as consistently unique predictors of overall decisional capacity. And there were no clear patterns of differential relationships between specific neuropsychological abilities and specific components of decisional capacity. Nonetheless, they say, the existing studies provide a solid basis for a priori hypotheses for future investigations. And then they go on to discuss the methodological limits that have led to this negative result. And then they conclude, despite the above limitations, the consistency of findings of significant cognitive decisional capacity relations in terms of consent to treatment, as well as consent to research, has clear pragmatic implications. That's the good news. Most notably, what are they? What are the clear pragmatic implications? Clinicians and researchers should be alert to the presence of cognitive deficits when providing informed consent. So that's the news from neuroscience. So Ryan and I are looking for an alternative. What would it be to take a phenomenological approach? How am I doing for time? Okay. So here's the question. How might you develop this MAC-CAT approach in order to bring in the phenomenology? And this was actually a project that I was approached about first by psychiatrists at the Maudsley. So here's the question. How can the phenomenological investigation of judgment inform our understanding of the capacity to make treatment decisions? So Ryan and I have 2 strategies with this. One strategy is to draw on results from what we call the phenomenological tradition, Husserl, Heidegger, Levinas, Loebstrup, whoever you want, and then apply them to this particular case. We think that there's fruit there to be harvested. And then the second resource is to use what we call second-person phenomenology, something like in Dennett's sense of heterophenomenology here. This is phenomenology which is, traditionally, the phenomenological tradition was sort of first-personal reflective, thinking about one's own experience and trying to articulate that. But we're interested here in second-person phenomenology, where you're trying to get at the experience of other people and articulate that. I think that's part of what Dennett was doing in Consciousness Explained. And so for that, we see that there are these experts out there that can really help with that. And those experts in second-person phenomenology are clinical psychiatrists. Clinical psychiatrists, their day in, day out work is to try to understand and articulate the experience of their patients. They're experts at it. Like a lot of this kind of practical professional know-how, it's largely implicit, their knowledge of how they do it. So we go into their clinical interviews and watch and see what they do. So those are the kind of resources. So just taking the first of those two strategies, what lessons are there from the phenomenological tradition? Well, for today, I'm just going to focus on one. I think there are quite a lot. But the most important one, this is if you went to Fred Olafson's seminars at UCSD, you would know this. Judgment takes place in a world. By a world here, I mean something like the Heideggerian sense of a world. So a world is a context of interpretation, a context where things show up, are available for interpretation, where some options show themselves to be significantly different from others. So to be in a world is sort of to find oneself oriented. It's to know which way is up. It's to be able to find significant differences among the various kinds of alternate options that are available to me. So that's one of the things that we want to focus on. What is this world structure in which decision and judgment takes place? And then one of the things you learn from the phenomenological tradition is that in order to investigate that world structure, there are these three things you ought to investigate. One is temporality, complicated topic. A second is others, other people. And the third is identity. So in the paper, we go through and talk about all three of these. For today, I'm just going to talk about the two, time and others. If we have time, we can come back to identity later. So what I want to do now is just walk through, let's think about these things. The phenomenological tradition tells us judgment takes place in the context of interpretation. Time and others are a really important part of that. So now let's look and see how time and others figure in the MAC-CAT-T, and then let's look and see how they figure in worldly decision-making. So here's time in the MAC-CAT-T. Capacity in the MAC-CAT-T is to be assessed at a time, at a particular time slice, if you will. And this is actually written into law in the MCA. They talk about material time. Where that means the time that matters for the decision. So if you're in a legal context, what matters is, did that person have competence at the time when they signed the consent form? Did they have capacity at the time when they signed the will? It's a time-specific competence. So the material time, that's the time that matters. And if you run a 15 or 20-minute capacity assessment, that's the time you're measuring the capacity at. The other way in which time shows up in the MAC-CAT-T is in what Ryan and I call future subjunctive temporality. So when you come to that part about the assessment of reasoning capacities, there's this characteristic set of questions that get asked. So here's one from their protocol. What do you believe will happen if you are not treated? So that's a question about the future under a certain kind of counterfactual sort of scenario. So future subjunctive. So we use this notion of future subjunctive reasoning. That's the kind of temporality that's at work in the reasoning of risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis. So those are the main two ways in which temporality shows up in the MAC-CAT-T, and that makes perfect sense. But now if you go to the clinic, and instead of running the MAC-CAT-T, you just ask patients, how did you make a decision? The first question we always ask them is, how did you decide to participate in this study? Here's a decision you just made. Just tell us about it, right? It's interesting how it shows up. Temporal structures in worldly decision-making turn out, I think, to be rather different from what's mapped in the MAC-CAT-T. Not to say that the part in the MAC-CAT-T is wrong. We're not against the MAC-CAT-T. The MAC-CAT-T is great. It's a fantastic tool, but I think it's leaving some really important things out. So here's one of the things that comes up in these clinical research. Patients are asked to explain their decisions, often talk about the past, before they talk about the future. We've been timing this now, actually. These are, again, unprompted. You're not running the test. You're just asking them spontaneously to explain their own decision-making processes. So you'll get a story about an earlier medical procedure. Very often you get a story about my father did something. These are kind of things that come up again and again and again in these unprompted accounts of decision-making. Now look, from the perspective of kind of classical decision-making rationality, that's strictly, it's not directly relevant to the decisions are about the future, right? And it's that future subjunctive reasoning that you ought to be able to do. But in fact, people end up talking about the past. So our observation about this, we think this is related to this worldly orientation. Decision-making ultimately requires orientation in the present. The present is a complicated thing if you're Heidegger. And this orientation is as much a function of the ways in which one meaningfully appropriates events from one's past as it is about calculations over possible futures. So there's this need to find sense in the present moment, and one does that by appropriating the past. That's a result that comes out of Heideggerian phenomenology, and it's a result that's showing up in these clinical studies. What about others, then, in the MACCAT-T? So you look for others in the MACCAT-T. There are not very many of them. I mean, you really get this sense, here's this solitary guy, and I'm interviewing him, I'm scoring him against these. But it does finally come up in chapter 8 of Applebaum's book, that when fear or anxiety appears to be interfering with a patient's ability to attend to and process information, introducing a known and trusted confidant or advisor to the consent process may permit the patient to make competent judgment. So here others do show up in this way. You can have a friend help ease your anxiety. But it's very significant. Look where this comes in. It's in the sections called Consequences of a Finding of Incompetence. It's only after you found somebody to be incompetent that then you start to bring others into the story. Again, we think that doesn't map onto worldly decision-making. So, sorry, this is a long slide, but let me just read it. This is a case. So an Alzheimer's patient has cognitive deficiencies that increasingly compromise the ability to communicate. When we consider his individual cognitive performance, significant deficits come to light. But he finds himself embedded in a community of family members and carers who have quite an intimate understanding of his situation, his preferences, his concerns, and so on. These others do not make decisions on his behalf, but they are able to help him complete his sentences. So Alzheimer's patients often forget very ordinary words. And in these situations with a confident, trusted advisor, they can fill in the blanks. And if you get it wrong, they tell you you've got it wrong. But if you get it right, they recognize what's right. So the patient himself may not recall the words he wants. He can clearly recognize and indicate when others express his thoughts correctly, and he stops them when he get it wrong. So for such a patient, faced with a treatment decision, this patient relies on his community of intimates. It's in virtue of their communicative partnership that he's able to discuss and assess his treatment options with clinical staff, understand and weigh the options, and communicate his own decisions. That's just an example of the way others play a role in real, it's the tip of the iceberg, I think. In fact, most of the decisions we make, our competence depends upon others in very substantial ways. All right, I'm almost to the end, because I want to know what you have to say about this. So in drawing some conclusions about this, Ryan and I introduced this notion of decision communities. And this is a way we've been trying to work with psychiatrists, police officers, and so on. Decision communities are all over the place. Science is a gigantic decision community, but so is the clinical set. Families are decision communities. So the thought here is that even our individual decisions characteristically take place from a position within a community of individuals. And then what's important is to start to typologize those. What are the different kinds of decision communities? So to begin with, we distinguish three kinds of decision. There is the case of the solitary decision. Maybe Robinson Crusoe, all by himself. You know, he made the decision to reserve that first crop from his farming there for the next season, not to eat any of it. So call that solitary decision making. Then you can have what we call collective decision. That's the we, first person plural. We decided. That's the electorate decided, or the department decided to do these things. No one person is the decider in that circumstance. But the cases that are the really important cases for us is this third category. That's the case where it's appropriate. Somebody can say, I decided. I was the one who decided, but others played an essential role in my being able to do so. So the Alzheimer's patient guy is kind of like that. It was his decision, but others played a role in constituting his capacity. So we're arguing with this notion then of distributed capacity. And so by that we mean that an individual may have the capacity to make decisions, but that capacity is itself distributed across his decision community. Again, that's not we decided, right? It's an I decided, but my capacity to decide is not something that I have all by myself in isolation. Okay. So look, there's some if you accept that much of my story, then I want you to accept these two corollaries. First of all, an individual's decision-making capacity can vary while measurement against individual cognitive performance criteria remains constant. So if you're somebody, for instance, there's a frontal lobe case we've been working with. He had bleeding during surgery, and it left him liable to these intense mood swings. Most of the time he's fine, but sometimes he gets into these he tried to sell his house for 500 pounds, you know, these sorts of things. And his family, in particular his wife, recognizes these moods coming on, and she basically slows him down. You know, you make sure there are no real estate agents around at that moment, right? And moreover, he knows that this happens to him, and he looks to his wife to slow him down in these sorts of circumstances. So he has capacity, it seems to me, in this sort of circumstance. But